how I could relate my talk to web science and the mind, open science and the web. I've got two of the things in there. So I thought I would go back to some early ideas about the web and the mind. And the first one that I have been looking at is H.G. Wells' World Brain. I don't know if you know this, 1937, towards the end of his life, this famous science fiction writer envisaged a world encyclopedia, not as static books, but as a mental clearinghouse for the mind, a depot where knowledge, ideas are received, sorted, summarized, digested, clarified, and compared. It would be in continual correspondence with every university, every research institution, every competent discussion, every survey, every statistical bureau. The encyclopedia organization might have the form of a network, constitute the material beginning of a real world brain. Well, that's my connection to mind, all right, more or less. Hi, Les. Good to see you. Right. And the next one I learnt from Wendy Hall, of course, about Vannevar Bush and the Memex. But I particularly like this particular quote from As We May Think. It's about the owner of the Memex, what he might do, is interested in the origin and properties of the bow and arrow. He has dozens of books. First he runs through an encyclopedia. Interesting article, leaves it projected on the machine. Next, in a history, he finds another item and ties the two together. On he goes, building a trail of many items, inserting a comment either into the main trail or joining to a side trail. Thus he builds a trail of his interest through the maze of materials available to him through the Memex, and his trails do not fade. So, I mean, it was really a rather prescient view of where we are now. He envisaged a machine full of outdated technology, microfilm and all that sort of stuff, enlarged, intimate supplement to the user's memory. So we've certainly made progress to the visions of Vannevar Bush and to H.G. Wells. And the last hero of mine I'd like to tell about is about J.C.R. Licklider, picture of him here. When he took over at DARPA, what was then called ARPA, he had this vision for interactive computing. In those days, most people were using computers like IBM. You hand your cards to this white-coated individual who puts this in this machine and gives you a result back 24 hours later or 6 hours later, whatever. But he wanted things to be interactive. And he had this vision that there were these computers all around the world. Of course, he didn't envisage the number we have now. Computers in those days were expensive devices, not very many of them. And you could get data anywhere, all the stuff linked together, use a remote computer, use lots of computers in your job. And again, this vision has come to pass. And so this was the first ARPA network with just 4 nodes. UCLA, that was Engelbart, that was Utah, and I forget what that one was. And this is how it grew by 1973, and this is a visualization of the internet today. So we have made progress along the lines of Bush and H.G. Wells. Though I'm not sure quite what H.G. Wells would have thought about Wikipedia. He had a vision of people whose job it was to be professional curators of the information, as opposed to crowdsourcing Wikipedia-like. So, what I have been doing really since about, well, probably most of my career in the university was trying to do multidisciplinary science, working with people outside of my little narrow physics discipline, then computer science. It was all about, when in 2001 I led the UK eScience program, it was all about the transformation that was place in the early 2000s, about how most scientific fields, and actually I would say most fields of research in general, are being transformed by the amount of data you can search. That was a concern of Vannevar Bush in 1945, and we've certainly generated a large amount more data ever since. And I mean, there are these huge projects like the astronomers and the particle physicists with the LHC and the Higgs boson and all that sort of stuff, and the square kilometer array, which will generate more data than you could possibly imagine per day. And they have big budgets, and they have software budgets, and they can do all sorts of things. But most people don't have those luxuries. Most people are down in these sort of medium and small. And it isn't just the volume of data that matters. It's really about the variety. So particle physicists have petabytes of data, but it's all of the same character. 2 particles coming in, a spray of particles going out. In biology, for example, you have gene sequences, sequences of letters. You have gene expression, which tells you what proteins are produced. Then you need the protein structures. You need the pathways. It's much, much more complicated. And actually getting knowledge and meaning out of that variety of data is a real challenge, as I learned when I was doing eScience. Velocity in Seattle, just up on the west coast where I live, they're putting a fiber optic cable on the seabed. It's on the Juan de Fuca plate, which actually is the plate that goes underneath the North American plate, where there will no doubt be a large earthquake at some point. So it seems to me like a good idea. But instead of having a science of oceanography where you send out a professor and 5 students on a boat and they go out for 3 weeks, come back, take their floppies back to the lab and go and analyze it and publish a paper with 2 students. Now there will be data coming in 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. There'll be so much data, you'll need to figure out what are the important things, how do you trigger on the important events, and so on. So velocity is important. And I sometimes add veracity, that's the provenance. How do you know the data's actually, what are the conditions it's been taken? Had something broken? Has someone done something to that data? You need to know what's been done to the data. So there's a lot more than just data volume. All right. And Peter Murray Rust sometimes refers to this as the long tail of science. Jim Gray, Turing Award winner, and Jim was my colleague at Microsoft. He died, he disappeared in this very boat some years ago, and he had this vision in the 90s that he started working with scientists. He was one of the people who invented databases. When you go to an ATM and do a transaction, you take money out of your account and you get money from the bank. You have to have a committal process, a 2-phase commit it's called. He's one of the people who invented the transaction processing. He realized that the large data sets, the very largest, were not going to be in commerce, but actually in science. And he wanted to understand how the technologies he was developing could deal with these large data sets. And he then got hypnotized by science. It's interesting, this is a picture I picked up off the web, but it's actually a picture I took, right? So it's sort of interesting how they get out there and go, but that's fine. I know it's the one I took because this is my daughter-in-law's knee. Right? Okay, so one of the projects that Jim Gray did very early on was really a truly transformative project in big science, and it was in astronomy. It was the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. Sometimes I call that the analog of the human genome, the cosmic genome project. And it was actually a high-resolution scan of a quarter of the night sky and generated, in those days, large amounts, hundreds of terabytes of data. Unconceivable. Now, Jim, he was not a theorist who sits there. He was a doer. He liked to do things. So he was in this organization called the National Virtual Observatory in the US. And they had infinite numbers of meetings where they discussed this, they discussed that, and he got so frustrated that with a colleague, Alex Saleh, and 2 graduate students, they said, let's just build something. And so they'd actually built one of the first web services, and they put all the data from the Sloan Digital Sky Survey on the web that you could actually go and interact with and go and do things with. And that was, in fact, transformative. It was a new way of scientific publishing because you published the data. I mean, there were about 300 million galaxies in this data set, and there were only about 10,000 astronomers. And so they clearly couldn't look at all that data before it was published. So you publish the data before you've written papers about it. And it also enabled things like Galaxy Zoo, the Zooniverse, this sort of crowdsourcing where you actually get the public to help you classify galaxies. And some genuine scientific discoveries have come from this sort of crowdsourced science. And so it was really a truly transformative way of doing things and really interested the general public in a way that captured the imagination that would have been difficult to imagine otherwise. And over the years, he formulated what he called the fourth paradigm. So let me just explain what I mean by that. The traditional ways of doing science are taking data, which we've done since the Egyptians and the Greeks and so Romans and so on, measuring the stars and things like that. And we've actually summarized a lot of the data in laws of nature, Newton's laws, Maxwell's equations, the Schrödinger equation, and so on. And that's theoretical science with mathematical equations, and you can analyze the equations, make predictions, go and verify them. So the traditional ways we've done science for hundreds of years is having experiment and theory going together. Ken Wilson, a Nobel Prize winner in the 1970s, particle physics, talked about computers. Since 1950, we've had digital computers, and they enable you to do different types of exploration. In situations where you cannot solve the equations analytically, it's too complicated, colliding black holes, you can't do experiments, galaxy formation, it's a little difficult to do an experiment, climate change, we're doing one right now, but we can't do other ones. So you can do simulations on a computer, and he called that the third paradigm. And in order to do that, you need to know about theory and experiment, but you also need to know about numerical methods, you need to know about algorithms, you need to know about computer architecture, parallel programming languages, and so on. So you need a new set of skills that students and researchers need to know in order to combine computational science with the other two disciplines. And what he saw that actually, when you have terabytes and petabytes of data, moving it around, organizing it, making it available, making it a schema, how you can analyze it, how you can reanalyze it, how you can visualize it, is a whole different set of tools. And this is what I would call eScience. These data sets can be distributed. Previously, in social science, you could get all the data on your machine. Now the data sets are so large that they're necessarily distributed. You can't download it all, and you have to do this distributed data exploration. And so scientists now are going to be increasingly overwhelmed with data sets. We're entering the age of the Internet of Things, where you'll have huge amounts of data coming in all the time. How are you going to find significant signals in all that data? Instruments, simulations, sensor networks, all these things. And he called this the fourth paradigm, data-intensive science. And that doesn't displace the other three, but it means there are new skills that researchers need to learn. And so that's really what I mean by data science. These are the only two books that I know that Microsoft has ever published under a Creative Commons license. So you're absolutely encouraged to download them. But this is a collection of essays. My role in that book was to bully the authors. I had a scientist and a computer scientist look to the future, where the field was going. And my role was to make them write an essay that was readable by a non-expert, as opposed to a scientific paper that was readable by a very small audience. So it's a very readable account, and these are some of the examples that we've done with researchers in universities over the years. But I still recommend that, because Jim Gray's last talk in the January he disappeared was about just that, and there's a version of it. Gordon Bell persuaded me, my colleague Gordon Bell, to do this, and he wanted me to write up Jim's last talk. Well, I wasn't very keen to do that, so he sent me the PowerPoint. I still didn't do it, so he sent me the transcript, and eventually I gave up and wrote it up. And it's really very interesting. He talks about two revolutions. One is the fourth paradigm, as I've talked about. The other one is relevant to this conference. It's about a revolution in scholarly communication, about which I learned a lot, of course, from our host, Stephen Harness. Anyway, okay. In addition to working with astronomers, Jim also worked with another pioneer. I usually talk about the three prophets of open access: Paul Ginsparg, of course, Stephen Harned, and this is David Lipman at the National Library of Medicine. So Jim worked with the National Library of Medicine team to produce a portable version of their PubMed Central. This is their repository for full-text versions of all the papers resulting from research that's been funded by the National Institutes of Health in the US. And this is now available in the UK, and now there's a European version of PubMed Central, and there's also a version in Canada and other countries. Okay, so this was a thing that influenced Jim's vision of the future, and I'll come back to it. You could go from the paper. The National Library of Medicine is a very fortunate discipline. They have hundreds of millions a year in order to do this, but they have a very curated walled garden where you have these databases which a lot of care and attention has been in. So you can go from the paper to the database where the data is. You can go and search through other databases. You can find new discoveries. And there's a tool called Entree which allows you to search across these databases. And that essentially was the model for Jim's vision of the future. Just as a word about the NIH open access policy. Okay, so this is the reasons why they wanted it, make it more visible. They're integrated with these research databases, and the policy allows you to monitor, mine, and develop its portfolio of taxpayer-funded research more effectively and archive its results in perpetuity. And of course, one of the points that Stephen makes, and that I absolutely see is necessary. Before there was a legal mandate, it was just voluntary, and the compliance was less than 20%. It was signed into law that you had to do it by George W. Bush in 2007, and the compliance rate for depositing papers went up to about 75% or so. But last year, they actually started, if you hadn't deposited your papers, they wouldn't give you another grant. And so as a result, the deposit rate has gone up to, well, it's over nearly 90%, something like that.
That's a little optimistic, but it's certainly over 60%, which is pretty good.
I think it's over 80%, but Stephen and I will, as you'll see, disagree on many things. It's very uncomfortable living with a profit, right? Oh, what was that? Okay, that's right. Okay, so I'm a part of a physicist, and this is the way I published ever since I was a grad student. We used to write a paper. Do you remember typewriters, anybody? Anyway, so we used to type our paper, make a carbon copy, and send it off to the journal, and then make copies which we call preprints, and send them around to, say, 100 of your peer institutions. And this was the tradition in particle physics, a fast-moving field. People used to be able to seize the latest preprint from Princeton or wherever, and as a result, be able to write their next paper based on the results in that preprint. And that was the tradition. And that was actually what Paul Ginsparg, when the 90s came along, he first of all had a spare server under his desk at Los Alamos. You send me, now they're all electronic, we can save postage, and I can put them up on this FTP server. And then, of course, the web came along, and it became arXiv, the web. It used to be under XXX LANL, and Stephen used to say it was the only interesting thing under XXX. I think something like that. Anyway, but it's now called arXiv. All right, changed its name, and it's now hosted by Cornell, where Paul Ginsparg is. Just some comments. It's 20 years old, has 7,000 e-prints submitted per month. The full text is 500,000, more than 200,000 articles downloaded each week by nearly 500,000 users. It, again, is an interesting model, just like I showed you the data in the case of the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. You publish the data before the scientists have written papers. Here, you publish the e-prints prior to the refereeing process, something Stephen definitely doesn't like. Right?
I love it.
But you advocate refereed versions.
Yes.
Right?
This is compatible.
Hold it. Acceptance in a journal is then essentially a post-publication quality mark. Only some of these things are accepted for physical review letters. And so actually having multiple slides of a paper is the sort of thing that gives nightmares to librarians. My wife is a librarian, so I can vouch for that. But there's a nice paper which I recommend you read, Citing and Reading Behaviors in High Energy Physics, How a Community Stopped Worrying About Journals and Learned to Love Repositories. And actually, I would say this is really an interesting case. This is a subject repository, and I think also in North America, the universities need to learn to love institutional repositories. Again, a disagreement point with me and Stephen, probably. Okay, and this also showed that there's a significant citation advantage. If you sent it to the journal, without posting it in arXiv, you actually accumulated fewer citations. And it's used by lots of people, 53 Nobel laureates, 31 Fields medalists, and so on. So it's widely used. This is what most particle physicists wake up every morning, they look and see what's new on arXiv. All right. And they game it to get, you know, they know when they update the thing and they want to get their thing up the top of the list, they play games. So it's become the way. I was puzzled as to how the journals we published in particle physics were Physical Review and Physical Review Letters by the American Physical Society, but there were also an Elsevier journal, Nuclear Physics B and Physics Letters. And I was slightly puzzled as to, you know, why didn't the publishers object to this? And so I asked Paul, and this is what he said. The editor-in-chief of Physical Review in the 90s was Marty Bloom, and he understood that the membership of the American Physical Society actually wanted to work in this way. And so he realized that, you know, the American Physical Society is made up of its members, and he had to figure out one way to work with it, and as he said, it made me proud to be a physicist. I also asked him about, what about Elsevier? But this was in the 90s, and that was long before publishers had websites. They didn't know about the web, and so by the time they understood what was going on, this was the way that everybody published, and if they'd stopped it, then nobody would publish in their journals. So I think it was a de facto situation. The last, which I think is relevant, it's now run by the Cornell Library, not by Paul Ginsparg. And they have a now sustainability model. They can actually measure how many downloads your university has from arXiv each year, and they charge you a few $1,000s. And so 27 institutions by 2010 had pledged support, and they now get something like $500,000, which enables them to support this service. So it's a really great model of a green arXiv, which is actually sustainable. Okay, so I want to move on beyond open access because I actually think that it's a done deal. All right, now, other people may disagree, but essentially, apart from a slight glitch in the UK with the Finch report, which has subsequently been corrected, right, by the Higher Education Council. Overturned, yes. So, indeed. But everybody else supports green open access. The Finch report didn't, and they wanted to give the publishers even more money, money we didn't have, which would come out of universities and research budgets, and we already can't afford what the publishers are offering. So every year I got a piece of paper saying, which journals do I want to cancel, all right, from the library. So all these things have happened, and I think it's an inevitability that some form of open access, which is based on a green form of open access, probably post-refereeing, I think this is actually what's going to happen, and there will be a sort of embargo period, something which is anathema to my wife, but nonetheless, Stephen's got his button, which enables you to request a copy, and that's been a tradition that's allowed. So I think open access will come. Policy, I'll just talk about two policies. This is California, University of California, which was a very significant one. I think the significant ones for me were Harvard, MIT, and University of California in the US. 8% of research funding. They produce 2 to 3% of all peer-reviewed papers in the world, and they're now committed to putting those in an open access green arXiv. And the faculty remains to working with publishers to transform the landscape in a sustainable way, and I think that's the correct thing to do. And just to show that I think institutional repositories are important, what you put out on the web, your university, UQAM, or University of California, Southampton, whatever, it's visible to the world. People can go and do statistics on it. This is just one example. It's Webometrics, which is an organization based in Spain, and it did, in my view, some rather silly metrics, but now it's evolving into something which is really quite good for actually number of research papers in the top 10 most cited papers in the field, number of files that you can make available, seen by Google Scholar and so on. So you'll have a ranking table here. I don't know where UQAM comes in, but you can go and have a look at their tables and drill down into that. So these things will happen, and actually it is a case of reputation management. Law condemns ways which I liked, that they will actually rank your university's web presence whether you like it or not. And if you claim you're a research university, you need your research to be visible, to be cited. If it's not being cited, how can it be impactful? Okay, so it's very important that actually university institutional repositories are run by the IT and library services, and they should be an important part, and there should be a university mandate and all that sort of stuff. And it's surprising to me that in Europe this is widely recognized and there's a coalition of open access repositories, but an enormously small number of North American universities, 1 or 2 only in this coalition. And that is the way we have to go, in my view. Okay, and just the last thing, you can see various things here, but I managed to make Microsoft Research, who is not publicly funded, so we don't have to make our research available, but we actually are doing, we have now a green open access policy in the true Harned style. So I did manage to get that done. Okay, so I think open access for publications is a done deal. A few details to sort out, which I can leave to Stephen to take on the publishers. Thank you very much for doing that. Open data, actually there are some worrying things we can talk about, but I think the battle is won. So I think the most interesting thing is about open data and open science. And this is a part of web science, if you like. So this is actually a slide when I got to Microsoft Research in 2005. This is actually a slide Bill Gates used. And this is what a publication should be in the future. This is sort of Vannevar Bush-like. You have interactive data. You can go to the data. Chemists at the moment have to take a picture of the graph and then measure it with a ruler to find the data points. That's ridiculous. You should be able to go to the data. Documents can be dynamic, collaborative. Research needs to be reproducible. You have to have the metadata there to make other people to make meaning of it, because it's an important thing. And you can also have other ways of reputation and influence. You can have different ways. You can say, well, Tony Hay liked this paper, Stephen Harned liked that paper. Well, I never pay any attention to what Tony Hay says, so we'll go with Stephen's vote. And so you can have different ways of influence. And then there was the Berlin Declaration, and all I'd like to pick out there was open access contributions, original scientific research results, raw data, and metadata. So, I mean, data is now part of the open access issue. 2013 also, the Open Data Charter, where open data by default, usable by all, releasing data for improved governance, releasing data for innovation. So that's the mantra for the G8, and there's a for the EU. So again, I think, and there is of course the White House OSTP letter, which also talks about data. So I think data is going to be the next, if you like. NSF are now expecting investigators to share with other researchers the data, the samples, and so on are gathered in the course of research. NIH reaffirms the concept of data sharing. Data sharing essential for expedited translation of research results into knowledge, products, and procedures to improve human health. And then, of course, there's data.gov, use of data beyond the walls of government. And that's not only in the US and other countries, but around the world. This was in 2010. A lot of my American colleagues were really panicking because the NSF was saying you had in your proposal to have a data management plan. And they didn't know what a data management plan was. And so actually, you can easily find that. One of the things we funded in the UK was the Data Curation Center, and you'll find there examples of data management plans. So I was able to direct them to data management plans. But again, it's expected to share data. And this is one that's, I suspect, causing a great deal of angst in UK universities. This is the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. And it says all institutions in receipt of their funding should develop a clear roadmap for research data management, which needs to be implemented by May the 1st, 2015. How is Southampton getting on with that, Wendy? Good. Organizations will ensure that their data is securely preserved for a minimum of 10 years. So universities have never had to do that, never be accountable for this stuff. And so this is a real, I think it's causing some interesting changes. So I think that will come in other places too, but it's interesting here that that's a driver from 2011. And then there's Public Library of Science, have a new data policy. Just to give two examples of data sharing, which to me are quite remarkable, because they're in the medical arena, and we're always told that the medical arena you have to worry about privacy and personal information. So this is actually in Alzheimer's. There's lots of charities fund research on Alzheimer's with small cohorts. Obviously, if they could agree, it would be better for that all to be combined. And believe it or not, they've agreed to do that. So 14 different centers have agreed to share their data. And what they do, it's typically made available within a week of it being collected. It took some time, and the first one put some up, and then someone else did, and it took some time. But now, actually from this ADNI website, Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, hundreds of scientists made thousands of downloads. And the interesting thing is that papers have been written from this data set by people who didn't take the data. And that's a really remarkable thing, but you also need to make sure that the people who took the data get some credit for the research. But that's one. The other example is equally interesting, which is autism research. Again, there are lots of organizations who fund autism studies, and again, they have different formats, and what they've agreed is some interoperability format. And so they've agreed on the data dictionary and all these things, 29,000 elements defined. They call it community science. And now you can actually go and look at a much larger data set than any one of these charities could have done together. And I think that's a remarkably encouraging thing about sharing data. Okay, I've talked about how particle physicists led the way in open access. I want to talk about how astrophysicists are leading the way in linking publications to data. There is a confusingly named system called the Astrophysics data system, which actually is about not data at all, it's about publications. What it also does gives you the paper, but it also gives you links to various other things. And in addition to this database of papers, there's also actual data, which is held in Strasbourg, the Centre de Données Astronomiques in Strasbourg, and they actually, between them, allow you to link the papers to the data sets. And so you have this here, these are these literature, here's the data, and a whole variety of tools enabling you to link between them. This is Alyssa Goodman, professor at Harvard. This is her vision of seamless astronomy. And the idea is that you create the appropriate tools and a whole set of tools. And I think that's one of the things that I think is important to experiment on how you connect these. The results are not enormously encouraging. This is a graph of the papers with the data links. And so what you have to recognize is these gray ones are the number of links that are broken. So in 2001, 44% of the links are broken 10 years later. And that's why we have to do better with the data sets, making an enduring DOI for data. Problems in research reproducibility. I won't read this, but I'll just tell you, Amgen in the USA did a study of 53 papers published in Science and Nature, and they tried to reproduce the results. They were only able to reproduce the results of these papers on cancer in 7 of the 53 papers. But that really is a crisis, I think, for some of this medical research. We really need to do better. And so there are problems, genuine problems in research reproducibility, which we need to do better.
10 minutes.
Yep, okay, I'll speed up. So Jim Gray in his talk talked about the need for you have these big experiments which have software budgets, but most people don't have that. So there needs to be lots of experimentation and tools. And I was just browsing the posters outside here, and there's some wonderful tools there. So I think we need to experiment, find the tools that people need to support the whole data life cycle, from acquisition to archiving and preservation. Visualization's one part, data mining, analysis is another. And of course, publication, dissemination, and sharing. So just as, for me, a heartening example. So we produced, Jim Gray did the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. Curtis Wong, who works in my team in Microsoft Research, produced Worldwide Telescope, which is probably the most widely used university-type tool that we have in astronomy, and in fact in almost any science for Microsoft, which enables you to view the universe not only in the visible, but also in the ultraviolet, the X-ray, the gamma ray, the radio waves, and so on. And you can do all sorts of wonderful things. You can take tours and everything else. And finally, after 5 years, we managed to persuade the XL team that they needed something which would do geospatial visualization. Now, it's obvious to you, but it takes time to get the product teams to do that. And so this is based on the same engine that was in Worldwide Telescope. So for me, that's a brownie point, right? And it's rather nice that you can now make this available to millions of people, can go and play with their data and visualize it in interesting ways. And it's also temporal. You can do these. One of the data sets they've got is drug busts in Chicago, and you can see on Saturday night there's more and where they come and so on. So it's tells you which areas to avoid, right? And this is okay. There's also it turns out many scientists and researchers store their data in Excel. Now that's fine, but if I asked you 5 years later what was in that Excel spreadsheet, what are the calculations behind it? Oh, and by the way, the software version of the spreadsheet doesn't exist. The software version of the operating system doesn't exist anymore. And how will you be able to figure out what's in that data? So this is a way, it's an open source add-in we developed with the University of California Digital Library to actually annotate your data in your spreadsheet. How do you actually, if you've got the data, how do you find it? These are two efforts to do that, repositories. But what I'd like to do is, when you've got all this data, what do you do with it? Now, there's huge excitement in most IT companies on the West Coast. It's about machine learning. And so this is machine learning and natural language processing. Now machine learning is a whole set of algorithms for dealing and finding signals in large amounts of data. And also for using that data to learn and get better, all right? So it's really very exciting. You're building systems that improve with experience, solve very hard problems, and actually the exciting thing, and you have to be careful now because Stephen's here, but they're approaching the level of human intelligence in the sense that this is a switchboard test for speech recognition. And what happened was we really didn't make any progress for about 10 years. But with these deep neural networks, which are various neural networks with inputs and outputs with multiple layers in between, we've now learned to do something with them, and people like Jeff Hinton and so on. And there's a dramatic improvement, and we're now getting down, for these particular tests, to sort of levels of recognition. And this is another one for computer vision. This is with the Kinect, which actually can recognize that I'm standing next to someone and my arm is behind them, and it's my arm, and they know it's because they have a depth camera here, and then they have to train it on all different types of shapes of people, sizes, and so on, different poses, and they have generated huge amount, millions and millions of synthetic as well as real images to train this system, and it's very robust. And so machine learning is going to translate to computer vision. This is actually using what are called decision trees, decision forests, but there's also other mechanisms like deep neural networks, which can show a computer. You and I and a 3-year-old child can tell a cat from a dog, but actually computers find that difficult. Now they can do that, and my colleague Peter Lee likes to show his system using his intelligent assistant Cortana to recognize what dog it is in this image, and she'll say it's a collie or it's a poodle or whatever. So computers are getting better at doing things that are obvious. My eScience research group in Microsoft Research is actually doing these sort of using machine learning for these societal challenges, environmental causes of disease, trying to find a vaccine for HIV/AIDS, and trying to actually sequence sugarcane, which is actually rather a complicated object to sequence. Role of the cloud, huge infrastructure. What I usually have is in my phone, I have my phone, and your phone to Cortana or Siri, you have an iPhone. Actually, there isn't enough processing in the phone to do it. What happens is it's sent up to the cloud. And less than a second, you get the answer. So the things you're holding in your hands become supercomputers. It transforms the way you think about things. So it really, provided you have an internet access, the cloud really can make changes. What we're looking at is putting Les, I'm trying to remind you, ePrints in the cloud, please, and a few other systems, so you can actually go and store data in the cloud and share it much more easily. And we have to look at the cost implications of that. If you want to experiment, we actually have a program called Azure for Research, where you can just write a couple of pages and you can get 100,000 hours and large numbers of gigabytes of storage, terabytes maybe, I can't remember exactly, but that's an offer for researchers to go and play. Data science in the future, because Stephen's about to cut me off. What's a data scientist? Well, so I'm using the phrase data science as opposed to web science, because this is what I do. There's people who are low level, making sure the data comes out, making sure it's actually processed in the right way, making sure you get a data set that can be used by a scientist. And then there are the people of the data analyst who actually run these algorithms, these complicated machine learning algorithms, which are very complicated. With a machine learning algorithm in the hands of an amateur, you can find virtual needles in haystacks very easily, all right? And so you can get misleading things. And then there are people who actually have to manage, curate, and archive the data. So these are many different skills involved in being a data scientist. But many other things there. This is ZENODO, which is a place you can store your data, grey literature and data at CERN. And so that's one possibility. There's now a new job from Nature Publishing Group called Scientific Data, where they don't actually store the data, but they store all the metadata and everything else. And again, that can give best practice to scientists to actually know how you can make the reproducibility of the research more reliable. This is a slide from Jim Gray's last talk, which is one that I really subscribe to. You have the literature, which will be open access, all right? And you can go from the literature. You need to be able to go to where the data. You can combine it with your data. You can get new results, new publications. You publish it and so on. And Jim, this is a distributed database, not held in one place. We have actually to be able to search across these federated data sets, and that's a very complicated thing. National Library of Medicine, it's a walled garden. They can curate perfectly well. We live in a much more anarchic, heterogeneous world, and we have to make that work, but it will increase the scientific information velocity. And one of the things I've become convinced about, there are people who reinvent the wheels, there are people who ignore other people's research. I'd like this sort of vision to make it impossible for researchers to claim they didn't know that this had been done by anybody else, and you get credit for what you do, and you actually increase the results of the scientific funding, because actually we do have a number of serious problems in both health and also environment facing the world, and I think now is the time that computer science and web science can actually help the world solve or ameliorate some of these problems. So that's the vision of the future. Some resources and just that. Okay, thank you very much.